Imagine Albemarle County is covered with spruce and fir trees and tundra. We may have giant things like mammoths and other large mammals roaming the landscape. Imagine if a tiny bit of that was still around. And as it turns out, as temperature has warmed over time, the tops of the mountains in Albemarle County, that actually a little bit of that ancient habitat from over 10,000 years ago actually has survived in Albemarle County, minus the mammoths, of course. But there's still a little bit of Canada, and there's these paper birch trees that tower over 75 feet tall, and little teeny tiny dogwoods like you would find called Cornus canadensis that you might find in Canada. And also another plant called boreal starflower. So this is a little boreal habitat surviving in Albemarle County for 10,000 years. When you think about the Dogwood Festival and, in Charlottesville, dogwoods seem to be something that's important to us. I'll come back to the dogwood. Well, here's a little tiny native dogwood that's very much under threat from climate change, because this only survives a little cold pocket in Albemarle County, has been there for over 10,000 years. And as the climate warms, this place is going to be toast. It's already struggling. We've been working with the Shenandoah National Park to institute controlled burns, which were actually a very important part of maintaining this habitat. But I bring this up to show you that biodiversity in Albemarle County is very much relevant to climate change. But also this idea of if we get biodiversity wrong, we're going to get climate change wrong. A really tragic thing that's happening right now, actually, today is the last day to comment. There's a solar farm going in by Chesterfield that's over 1,000 acres, and it's going to wipe out one of the last pitcher plant bogs in Virginia, including a whole list of state critically threatened species. So here, if you clear 1,000 acres of trees, including wiping out endangered species in Virginia, that's not a win for climate change. So whether we get biodiversity right or not, I think is a good metric about whether we're getting climate change right, whether we have policies that make sense. Now, there's some really practical ways that the Natural Heritage Committee has identified that the county can really help address these issues. One of these is addressing invasive species. And so I'll give you an example. One of these invasive species, the hemlock woolly adelgid, the hemlock trees are, they're evergreen trees. They are very important for shading and cooling streams. Back growing up in Sugar Hollow, the eastern hemlocks used to cover the streams. And as the hemlock woolly adelgids came in, it's killed off a lot of the hemlocks. It's raised the temperature of the water. And so that's also made it hard for species like trout to survive, which then impacts fishermen and recreation. So there's a whole cascade of events that happens when we have an invasive species like that. So having funding, thanks to working with the county, we have gotten some funds to treat some of the hemlocks in the county. We've treated some of the hemlocks at Biscuit Run. And there's some hemlocks we've identified in the Sugar Hollow area and other places that we would like to treat so we can help preserve that species. There's also threats, posed by plant invader species. And so a lot of those we have for our, a lot of our really critically important habitats in the county are threatened by a range of invasive species like multiflora rose, Japanese stiltgrass, autumn olive. And so, having some funding by the county to address invasive species in those places can buy time for these habitats to adapt. And these habitats are already under enough stress as it is, that they, having the dual threats of climate change and invasive species is really something that can really tip the edge and destroy these places. So then the other piece too is talk about our conservation easements. The county did have a large amount of funding for conservation easements. As you saw, we've made some great progress in the county through the ACE program and through other partners like PEC getting conservation easements in Albemarle County, but that funding has largely vanished. And so, if we're really serious about protecting, doing something about climate change, obviously keeping our intact, healthy forests is really critical. And it's not just about any conservation easement either, even though there's that nice map of the lands protected by easements. Some of those are just agricultural easements. So they may be easements on a big farm field. And so they may or may not really be doing much for climate change. So for a long time, agricultural properties had a higher rating in the scoring system than areas with high quality biodiversity and intact forests. So what we've asked the county, and what we'd ask for you to do too, is to reinstate the ACE program, to fully fund it, but also reconsider the scoring system and give more points for places with high quality biodiversity, with intact forests, and with the good stream buffers. So these are some of the things that. So first, I'm going to stop there for a second, see if I have any questions before I proceed.
Yeah, Lonnie, I'm from the Midwest originally. I'm really, you probably won't divulge it, but you give me a general idea of where the paper birch grove is?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give you it's way off trail in the middle of the, I mean, it's probably it's fairly protected, but it's actually on it's on a quartzite talus slopes, these big blocks of quartzite, which is kind of like sandstone. And what happens is snow and ice builds up under these blocks during the winter, and then the summer it melts and cool air continues to seep out all through the summer. In fact, there was a famous site elsewhere called Ice Mountain, maintained by the Nature Conservancy, that's very similar. And they used to actually be able to harvest ice from that site even in the middle of the summer.
That's the one in West Virginia, or is that?
Yeah, it is in West Virginia. Yeah. So this is a very similar habitat to that in many ways, is that it's a quartzite talus slope where cool air seeps out of that area and helps keep that. It's like a little cold pocket. So, and it is the furthest southeast occurrence in the entire United States of Cornus canadensis.
Yeah,
so
I mean, the only other place I heard of in this area that had it was Neighbor Mountain in the northern part of Shenandoah National Park. The loop around Jeremy's Run supposedly has a nice stand. Well, I'm not sure of a nice stand, but a stand of paper birch. So interesting that it's this far south. I guess the one, it's not really a question, but just sort of like a supporting comment. There's been a lot of news recently about tipping points in the Amazon due to deforestation and the loss of biodiversity and invasive species coming in. So I guess when you lose a forest, you not only lose biodiversity, but you have direct climate impacts because it changes the water cycle because of the loss of transpiration. So I totally agree with the thrust of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and so another piece, let me see if I can share my screen here. Screen share. Oh, you have to enable screen sharing for me.
Okay, it should be coming right now.
Okay, share
and
screen.
Lonnie, Kat's got a question or comment.
Okay,
while you're screen sharing, Lonnie, could you talk a little bit about the funding for the ACE program and positions at the county, because the county budget process gets started tomorrow, and I think this group would be really interested where they could maybe speak up in terms of kind of critical areas of financial support to make things happen.
Well, yeah, that's exactly why we're bringing this up to you, is that that would be one of the key things that we would ask you to support is funding for the ACE program and also in funding for invasive species management. So if you could,
and is it true, Lonnie, at this point, ACE program is zeroed out?
at this point, it is zeroed out. And so one of the things, some talking points that I encourage you to consider is that there's been a lot of miseducation, misunderstanding at the level of some members of the Board of Supervisors. Some people think that the ACE program costs the county money. Actually, the ACE program actually saves the county an enormous amount of money. And how this works is that some of you may know there's this revenue sharing agreement between Albemarle County and the city of Charlottesville. Well, any of the property that is when we get a conservation easement on a piece of property, it lowers the amount of money we pay Charlottesville forever. So this is a very relevant thing. It also changes the funding formula for schools, so that we actually get more money to fund schools than we do before, once we get these easement programs in place. And then you also have to measure we have these programs called land use valuation, which I think of as sort of renting conservation. So we give people a tax break for presumably having agricultural uses on their property. But the thing about that is they can at any time turn around and say, hey, well, when we changed our mind, we now want to develop this area. And they do have to pay a certain number of years of back taxes, but they can convert that to residential development or other uses. Whereas a conservation easement is forever. We pay millions and millions of dollars every year for land use valuation. And it's not certain, it's just renting it. But conservation easements are permanent. So you can rent conservation for millions of dollars every year, or you can buy conservation one time and have it forever. So it really is a good use of county money.
That's so true, Lonnie. I'll tell Cville100, I'll do it tomorrow, but we did a recent analysis about the financial impact of conservation easements, because there's some members of the Board of Supervisors who still think that they cost the county. And we were actually able to prove that the county actually benefits from land under conservation easement because of the state funding formula on schools. So I'll send it out to Cville100 so you can see that analysis.
Yeah, and you should also look at look at land use valuation. If you look at an individual piece of property, you'll see that the way it works, we pay a conservation, we have to pay a penalty for every piece of land under land use valuation to the city of Charlottesville. We're paying revenue sharing on the base assessment of that property, even though the landowner is not assessed at that rate. So when you look at the land value tax and you subtract that from the base amount, that's the amount that we're paying a penalty on to the city of Charlottesville. When you get an easement, it lowers the total value of the base assessment of the property down to the land use value. And so that reduces our revenue sharing to Charlottesville. So that's a pretty big benefit. And I did the calculation one year and it came out to millions of dollars. But it is a rather complex formula. So,
and I'd say, wouldn't you agree, Lonnie, the other piece of that is making sure that when the ACE program's under consideration and making sure that we have better criteria for biodiversity protection and protecting forest for carbon sequestration, stream buffers, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. We have properties we put under conservation easement under the old scoring system that had no buffers on their streams whatsoever. And we actually had properties that were actually what we call county special sites, areas with exceptional biodiversity with rare county species that were excluded from the ACE program. The people that had applied to get those sites protected, they were excluded. So it is very important not only that we get funding, but we get funding in a way that values biodiversity and carbon sequestration. And speaking of stream buffers, you see the slide that I have up, you see percent of unbuffered streams, and this is only at 35 feet. Really, the county standard is really 100 feet for stream buffers. Oh, I see someone has a raised hand before I get on this. Bob?
Yeah, you've been talking about the county incentivizing the conservation easements, but are there programs of education to help people simply reduce the amount of area that they're mowing for a lawn in an estate, or the area that they have dedicated to just grass, and letting that revert back to a mixed forest? I did that in a kind of a small way in my own backyard here in the urban ring, and I found that it was my incentive was I didn't have to mow it anymore.
Yeah, so thank you for pointing that out. There actually are these programs. There's we actually have we call the ACAP program and the VCAP program, which is the Albemarle Conservation Assistance Program, the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. They actually will pay for some of the costs, for most of the costs of converting lawn grass to native plants or installing rain gardens and biofilters. And so this is a great way that we can take our lawn, which is not capturing carbon. In fact, those roots only go down like, a few inches, and putting in native plants, you have deep roots and store carbon into the soil, and also provide pollinator habitat. So I think these are great programs. They're through the local Stormwater Conservation District. The county helps fund some of these, and that's matched with state funding. So it's a great program that was born locally. And you can look at, can find this program either at the county website, or you can also see at Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation District. So pretty easy to find, but those are really great programs. And even if you don't choose to accept the funding, they do offer free technical assistance, so you can still get advice on doing this yourself, even if you don't take the money. I will caution, I don't recommend just letting things go necessarily. So just not mowing, when somebody's not mowing is better than mowing. If you just stop mowing, you're going to be overwhelmed with invasive species. It's much better to actually manage that. A lot of people, there's what we call sort of plant blindness when people look around. I think a lot of people think when they look around at the landscape of Albemarle County, they're mostly looking at native plants. In truth, most of the plants you see around you are not native. They were brought over here from Europe or from Asia. Our native landscape has been extraordinarily impacted by a lot of the plants that have come over and taken over our landscape. A good example of our grasslands, lawn grasses are not native. They're cool season grasses that are brought over for the sake of cows, because they didn't, but our warm season grasses are greenest in the middle of the summer instead of, greenest in the winter. And the cool season grasses are really developed, they're adapted to northern cool Mediterranean climates. And so in the summertime, they want to die back. And so you have to give them a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer to keep them around. That, of course, means a lot of carbon, certainly. It also means a lot of pollution in streams. It means nitrogen and phosphorus going into streams. It causes algae blooms, which can be toxic, can kill pets and even people. So that's pretty concerning. Some of you may have noticed about like some waters, some areas have been closed, like Chris Green Lake and other places because of toxic algae blooms. So that whole thing with lawn and fertilizer and all the stuff that we're doing, that's some bad stuff. And there are definitely some things county residents can do and programs they can take advantage of to help deal with that whole thing. Does that answer your question? Sorry, a little rambling.
And also, I just want to add, like in terms of education, the counties had set up last year as like a sustainability hub, and it's got some really great tips talking about reducing mowing and things that you can do, like good stewardship practices. So that was one thing, a way of promoting and educating the public.
And if I could comment, in the phase one of the county's climate action plan. When the plan was being developed, Scott Clark headed up on staff a landscape sector group that I was working within. And one of the things we came up with there was to try to promote what we decided to call victory forests. And this goes back to Bob's point, thinking of all the large lot subdivisions and all the 20-acre lawns that people seem to mow on Saturday, despite better things they could be doing with their lives. And the idea was to promote forests on a lot of the small forests on these lots, thinking that this would help sequester carbon. And I think there would be a nice co-benefit here, symbiosis with the work of the Natural Heritage Committee. So, I mean, I think that's just one small example of how climate action and biodiversity and ecosystem protection really reinforce each other.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I totally agree with that. I think you know, also going back to what Christina mentioned too, it's important, I think, to think beyond just planting trees, but also think about natural communities, that we are protecting and restoring natural communities, and think about, you know, a lot of the trees that like are planted in forests and pine plantations or loblolly pine, which aren't even native to most of the county. So, and you know, if you are missing all the different tiers and layers of that forest, then you're missing out on all the carbon sequestration that can happen. It's also important to note that large parts of the Piedmont were actually grasslands when colonists arrived. And those grasslands are also important carbon sequestration tools. So whether you choose to plant trees or to do native wildflower meadows, those are both great tools in terms of what you can do at your own place to help sequester carbon, also provide very critical pollinator habitat too. Another thing I wanted to show you too, these are all this map in front of you is all the streams that are impaired in Albemarle County. You see all the ones that are red and yellow. And so this is a really pretty serious problem. Back in 2014, well, prior to 2014, we had a policy on the books, the Water Protection Ordinance, that protected 100-foot buffers on the sides of every stream, except for properties that were that could be documented as agricultural. After 2014, quietly, the county, with no public input whatsoever, quietly gutted the Water Protection Ordinance. And now the only time the 100-foot buffer is enforced is when there's active development occurring, when there's like a house being built. And then it only applies to 2 acres around that house. And so this is a pretty big change to the county's water protection strategy. We went from requiring perpetual 100-foot buffers on all these streams all over the county to only requiring them when development is occurring, basically treating them like silt fences. And so that's a big loss in terms of carbon too. I think going back to that 2014 policy, and I can talk a lot more about this at some other point. You know, if you have 100 feet of native grasses or native trees along a river, along every river in Albemarle County, that is a lot of carbon sequestration. There's very few other policies the county could do besides requiring those 100 feet that it used to have for decades before 2014. There's very, very little else the county could do that has as much consequence as putting that policy back in place.
It also would presumably increase flood resiliency to have that forested buffer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely would. So there's a lot of benefits to doing that. You know, and you can see, I mean, and the standard for impairment is from DCR is what's called the sort of recreational standard. Like if you wouldn't want your kids to play in that stream because they might get sick, that's considered an impairment. And the number of streams and rivers that we have with bacterial impairments is very concerning. It hasn't happened. We have had instances of pets dying in Albemarle County because they've been exposed to contaminated water. We haven't yet had a person die yet, but it has happened in other localities in Virginia. Things like flesh-eating bacteria, wounds that don't heal. This is some nasty business that people should take very seriously. And so the way that I think about it too is we know the other standard for water quality is what's called the is a biodiversity standard. Basically, if a diversity of little invertebrates can live in the water, of native invertebrates, then it's also safe for you, right? So if we don't have biodiversity in our streams, you don't want your kids to play in it. You don't want to fish in it. You probably don't want to kayak in it. You probably don't want to drink it. So protecting biodiversity of streams is also protecting our own health. And likewise, there's a terrestrial standard of biodiversity, I believe, as well. If you don't have biodiversity on the land, if native plants won't grow there, if you don't have native pollinators, I think that there are similar health consequences. There was a study that was done about a bird flu that found that areas with lower biodiversity had a higher incidence of bird flu. So more people were getting sick in areas with lower biodiversity. So I think that there's some really big consequences that we need to look at, particularly as climate change affects Albemarle County. About how do we, biodiversity is sort of our safeguard. It provides us, resilience is one of our ways of, adapting. I think we really need to look at how we can do better at protecting those systems.
Lonnie, do you have a figure for the amount of or the loss of tree canopy in the county over the last, let's say, 20, 25 years?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Christine, we should make a point to ask Scott that at the next meeting. I know Charlottesville has some better numbers on that.
And the other comment I'll make is that I forgot to mention that in the General Assembly there are a number of concerning bills. I think they had survived to some extent until crossover. Bills about biomass burning and regulations on forests designed for biomass production, for burning, and the impact that will have on native hardwoods. And I've read some of the language of the bills, and it's really kind of atrocious, the reasoning in some of these bills.
Particularly in the southeastern part of the county, there's a lot of areas that are being converted to pine plantations, and I suspect biomass is driving a lot of that stuff. There's several areas of several of our special sites that like one area I'm still trying to access. There's one of the few areas that climbing fern, one of our few native vining ferns, actually our only native vining fern. But it's been turned into a pine plantation. It's been logged and I hope not herbicided. So I don't know if that species still exists anymore in that part of the county, but it's a big concern. You can see from the air, the change, particularly in the southeastern part of the county. A great tool is Google Earth. You can go back and you can sort of scale through time and you can see how the landscape has changed. And so even if we still have as much forest as we had before, I dare say that a lot of that forest has changed radically in its quality.
Yeah, and I did read that the pine forests are not as effective in the sequestration of carbon as the mixed hardwood forest.
I mean, if you were in the southeast of Virginia, where you have longleaf pine savanna, or you have like a native pine forest that's an intact habitat, that is a highly effective system at sequestering carbon. It's just not effective here where those forests are not actually supposed to be. And we do have some native pine forests, Table Mountain pine and some other things that are very effective at sequestering carbon. But once again, those are complete ecosystems, not just, one tree and then monoculture. The tree equivalent of a lawn. Now, I will say there are better and worse ways to do forestry too. I mean, there are responsible foresters who have, more sustainable ways to do forestry. And I don't really have time to get into that, but there are definitely better and worse ways to do forestry that, can be supportive of biodiversity and still allow for people to make an income on that property.
If I can make a quick comment before we wrap up, it's relevant to this topic. We recently just arranged to have Mike Collins, who's head of American Climate Partners, and used to be, for example, many years ago, the staff member to the Thomas Jefferson Sustainability Council. Mike's been working for years on building sort of resilience in rural areas, and the American Climate Partners, they're very interested in promoting carbon sequestration in ag areas and ag work. And one of their projects is called the Virginia Grasslands Deep Carbon Project. And so on March 14th, we'll have Mike, who's a brilliant, great guy, come talk about the Climate Partners organization now and this particular project. So I think it would be kind of relevant if we want to learn more about sort of grasslands and how they might fit into the whole sequestration picture.
I think that's great, and that's an excellent point. Particularly there's a lot of benefits to farmers too, and there's a lot of programs that benefit that practice. Just changing the way you graze cows in the landscape and integrating native warm season grasses, you can change a property without changing the number of cows, keeping the cows the exact same. You can change a property from a place that is contributing carbon to the atmosphere to a property that's sequestering carbon. You can change it from a property that is impairing biodiversity to enhancing biodiversity. I was at a presentation about mob grazing at a farm in Albemarle County, and the farmer was talking about just by changing his grazing practices, how he noticed that by rotationally grazing his cows, I'm not going to go into greater detail than that, I'm sure Tom could, that he noticed significant biodiversity increasing on his farm. And as he was talking about this, right in the background, I heard a pair of bobwhite quails chirp up and start singing. And I mean, at that moment, I was kind of sold. It's like, well, I mean, if you have bobwhite quails singing to cheer you on for your comment, then you must be doing something right. But, a lot of these practices too involve, like they benefit farmers because warm season grasses, in the middle of the summer, fescue can actually be toxic to cows. So if they can forage on warm season native grasses in the middle of the summer, it actually provides for healthier cows. But warm season native grasses are also very important for species like bobwhite quail and other grassland species and butterflies. So you kind of have a win-win there where you can benefit both agriculture, biodiversity, and climate change all at the same time. Okay, any other questions? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, it was terrific, Lonnie. That was great. Thanks so much.
Lon, I have one question. Lonnie, could you repeat the information about where property or homeowners can get help in converting their land?
Yeah, let me see if I can I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to put it in the chat, okay?
Oh, great. Thank you.
So it's... Okay.
And I'm going to put the Albemarle County Sustainability Hub there, because that link, because you can also link to any of those programs to the VCAP program from that as well.
Are any of them viable for Charlottesville?
Yes.
Landowners? Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, actually, they have their own separate program, except theirs is called CCAP, Charlottesville Conservation Assistance Program, and it's funded by the stormwater utility fee. So they have a very similar program. I put the. So yeah, I just dropped it in. It's tjswcd.org. It's in the chat.
Thank you.
I will say it's not a sure thing. It's a competitive grant type program. So you are in competition with other people based upon the quality of your project. So just know that that's how the thing works. But that said, right now there is a lot of funding. So there's a really great chance your project will be funded.
And I just want to mention that Tom Olivier also has been a former member of the Natural Heritage Committee and was pivotal in really in the development of the biodiversity action plan. So I just want to recognize him for all of his great efforts in that realm. And thank you, Lonnie.
The Biodiversity Committee and the predecessor, the work group, have been going since 2002. And so it's a standing committee. And so it's a great many people. I was one of the earlier ones. Lonnie kept it going in the years 2014 when we had a board of supervisors that was extremely unsupportive, I would say. And Christine's been kind of manning the helm. Oh, I shouldn't say manning, I'm sorry. Has held the helm of the committee in recent years. So it's really been a community of people concerned about biodiversity that have just kept it going for, a couple of decades now in the county's organization.
Yeah, it's all by citizen volunteers. And I think there's so many ways too, just like even with your cell phones, there's a nice little application on your cell phone called iNaturalist. If you're out taking a hike or you're out on your own property and you see something unusual, an unusual plant or insect, or take a photograph of iNaturalist, identify it, you're contributing to citizen science, maybe something worth protecting. And so you can help us gather biodiversity and participate in that citizen science right from your own cell phone and your own property.
I'll make a last comment from me anyway, is that, and at the last biodiversity meeting, I just sat in the first time for a while. Scott Clark, who's now the natural resource manager, has been integrated into the comprehensive plan development team. And the planners are beginning to ask Scott for recommendations from the committee and in general from the natural resource community on things that should be going into the plan. And my understanding is the committee will be visited by planners to ask for input from the biodiversity committee on natural resource matters. So along with allowing input on biodiversity protection and all of that end of it, it's a sort of an additional opportunity for input on climate action concerns and carbon sequestration and so on. So I was really pleased to hear that we've got another entree into the planning process for natural resources through the committee starting soon, I think.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned that I'm one of the Albemarle County Planning Commissioners. So I hope that as you have concerns about environmental issues, that you'll reach out to me and to the Planning Commission. I think that I'm very supportive of making sure those issues are heard at the Planning Commission. But the point about the comprehensive plan is very important. I hope you have a lot of discussions in the future about that. I have some concerns about the way the consultants have driven that process. So I hope the environmental community is really looking through all those things that are said with a fine-tooth comb, and hope you all get out and take the survey too. That's on the AC44 site right now that talks specifically about natural resources.
Can I just build on that for a second? Thank you, Lonnie, so much. And I sent out a reminder to Cville100 about taking the survey. I've got issues with how the survey is designed. There are some really good comment sections. I would urge everyone to take good use of those comment sections and For example, biodiversity really doesn't show up very much. Protection of the rural area is not really a question in the survey, but you can add your comments in the different sections. And I guess, Lonnie, one of the things I'm worried about, so I was a planning commissioner a long time ago for Albemarle County, and back in the 80s, director of housing and community development for Albemarle County. I've been a little surprised that the planning commission doesn't seem to be driving the comp plan process as much. And I sent around to folks the Code of Virginia, and I'm really a little, I want to say this in front of the group, I'm a little concerned that Albemarle County isn't really following the Code of Virginia. The Planning Commission is supposed to be really the beginning and the end of the comp plan process before it goes on to the Board of Supervisors. And that, I think, was designed in Virginia because the Planning Commission allows a lot of transparency and public input opportunities. So I know several planning commissioners are concerned about this, but I wanted to state for the group, I really think we need to be a little radical and push for more planning commission involvement in the comp plan.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak necessarily for my fellow planning commissioners, but it's something I've definitely heard from our former chair, Karen Firehawk, and and other people. There is concern among us that there's this sort of consultant-driven process, and they bring these things to us, and they want us to comment on the things they've already brought to us fully fleshed out. If you look at the minutes from our last planning commission meeting, we talk about this quite extensively.
Well, and they kind of jumped, sorry to interrupt, but they kind of jumped over you, went to the Board of Supervisors, said, here's the new outline for the comp plan, and it didn't come out of the Planning Commission. And suddenly the rural areas chapter sort of mushed in with other things, and it's been one of the defining features of the Albemarle County Comprehensive Plan. So I'm a huge fan of planning commissions. I think they are the citizen soldiers of planning, and it's really one of the first ways for the public to be able to have input.
Yeah, and I think I'm biased because Tom and I and Scott Clark helped write most of the natural resources section of that comp plan, and I think it's great. I think it's like a great plan. That's one of the best comprehensive plans in the state. As I said, I'm biased. The idea that we need to scrap that and start from scratch is kind of concerning to me, because there's a lot of really, really good stuff in that. I mean, sure, it can be improved. I mean, everything can be improved, but I'm concerned about some consultant, one size fits all group of people. I work in IT also at the health system, and man, when outside consultants come in to do anything, it never ends well.
Well said, Lonnie. And I also think the whole Albemarle County's won a lot of awards and had national recognition for its comprehensive plan, and suddenly it is being thrown out, baby with the bathwater. So use the survey, I think, as a way to say, what are you doing and why are we changing things, and go back to the plan.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, any last comments there, Lonnie? Yeah.
Just one. I know that we specifically, one of the things that's really important for the Planning Commission to have is to have a full in-depth discussion about conservation. We should have like a whole work session devoted to just conservation strategies. And so far that has not happened, even though despite the first phase was supposed to be about our, rural protection strategy. It's weird how they said that first, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Well, Lonnie, thank you from the Cville board. And
one question. Lonnie, which magisterial district are you representing? Samuel Miller or
Whitehall? I moved.
Pardon? Where are you now?
I'm in Sugar Hollow. I used to be.
So Whitehall.
I used to be in Batesville.
Gotcha.
All right. Well, thank you for the good presentation and thoughts this evening, Lonnie. I know everyone in attendance